Today, what we are going to do, we're going to talk about CARICOM's trading arrangements. I said trading arrangements here because we have trade agreements, properly so-called, and then we also have these unilateral preferences that are extended to us by the US, for example, through the Caribbean Basin Initiative and also CARIBCAN. So because the organizers asked me to include CARICOM, I decided I will refer to it as CARICOM's trading arrangements and not just trade agreements. So before I get into the meat of the matter, just to give you guys a little bit of info about the SRC, we are the Caribbean's leading trade policy training institution. And our work falls into three main pillars: trade policy training. So some of you might have heard about the Masters in the International Trade Policy. I am an alumna of that master's program, and there are many who are alum of that program as well. We've been doing that for the past 20 years, and I also teach in that program. We also do research on international trade matters, and we also do outreach. So you will see myself and others from the SRC writing things in the newspaper or writing articles, etc., dealing with issues of contemporary trade issues. So that's just a little bit about the SRC. With regard to what we're going to do this morning, the scope of the presentation, as we mentioned, we're going to talk about the trade agreements that CARICOM has with third states. So namely Venezuela, Dominican Republic, Colombia, Costa Rica, the EU, and the UK. We'll speak a bit about CARIBCAN because that was one of the things that was identified by the organizers. And then some of the important things to note when seeking to rely on a trade agreement or a trade arrangement. And then, of course, some useful resources for utilizing these trade agreements. The truth is that really and truly, you don't really have to sit down and go through a trade agreement schedules anymore. There's so many online resources that you can use, and I'll identify, we wouldn't go through them, but I'll mention a couple of them towards the end of the session. So I'm not saying that it's not important to understand the trade agreement, it is, but you don't have to go through looking through the schedules anymore like how you used to years ago, because there are online databases that you can use in order to see, okay, what is the applicable tariff for this, if there's any, for this particular good, right? So what is not covered in this presentation? So you guys are customs brokers, you would be dealing with goods, right? So we're not looking at market access commitments other than for goods. So i.e. we're not talking about services, we're not talking about investment, right? We're not talking about individual CARICOM countries' partial scope agreements. These are things you guys might know already, but I'll define what I mean by partial scope agreements just in case a little later on. And except for CARIBCAN, we're not going to get into the unilateral preferential trading arrangements, and we're not talking about CARICOM and CSME. Right? So that's just to set the scope of what we're going to do. So some common objectives of trade agreements, and it's important that I talk about this, are to reduce and eliminate tariff and non-tariff barriers. Well, you guys know this, obviously, to trade in goods among the parties, remove barriers to trade in services, in some cases, provide some measure of certainty for traders, because obviously if you have a trade agreement there, you have something in writing, you have something that you can rely on, you have certainty of market access, right? Now, market access doesn't necessarily mean market penetration, but at least you have the market access on paper. And then to encourage bilateral trade and investment flows, address other issues which might impact on trade between the parties, increasingly to promote economic and other cooperation between the parties. So increasingly you're seeing trade agreements including things like environment, cooperation in terms of the environment, cooperation in terms of human rights, cooperation in terms of, labor and other things as well. And then promoting competitiveness and fostering development in each of the parties. So these are just some of the things that countries have in mind when they go to sign trade agreements. And of course, these things are usually covered within the first few articles. You will usually see an article stating the objectives of the trade agreement if you look at the actual text of the agreement, right? So there are 5 main types of trade agreements. I don't know to what extent you guys are familiar with this. I assume you are, but you know, it would be remiss of me if I don't mention this because sometimes they get mixed up. So, and each of these is increasing levels of commitment. So a partial scope agreement has the lowest levels of commitment, and then economic and monetary union will have the highest levels of commitment. So a partial scope agreement would be an agreement between two or more countries to reduce tariffs amongst each other, but with limited range. So it only covers goods and it only covers a narrow scope of goods, right? And it usually has a built-in agenda for further liberalization. So examples of these would be like, those of you from Trinidad, you know, I think there's one with Trinidad and Chile, and then Belize, Guatemala, and then I think they were talking about one with Honduras as well. So there are different types of agreements, and the partial scope agreement would be the one with the lowest level of commitments. That only covers goods, as I said, and it covers a narrow range of goods. Then there's a free trade agreement. So a free trade agreement, that's an agreement between two or more countries to eliminate tariffs and other import restrictions amongst themselves, but the countries retain the freedom to impose different tariffs and other restrictions on imports from third parties, right? So an example of this would be like the CARIFORUM-UK EPA, the CARIFORUM-EU EPA. Looking internationally, an example of this would be the USMCA, what was commonly known as NAFTA until it was renegotiated under the Trump administration. So this is a higher level of economic integration, whereas with a partial scope agreement, it's only a narrow set of goods. With a free trade agreement, it includes goods, it also includes services, and it also includes, in many cases, investment as well. Then you have a customs union. So a customs union now has all the features of a free trade agreement, but what differentiates it is that there's this thing called a common external tariff, which you guys will be, you know, experts on. So the common external tariff will basically be setting the rates that the countries would charge to goods coming from third countries, that is goods coming from outside of the free trade area, right? Or the customs union in this case. Then there's a common market, which CARICOM would be like a hybrid between a customs union and a common market. So it allows, a common market allows for the free movement of factors of production within a common economic space. So free movement of capital, people, goods, etc. right? And then lastly, the highest one would be an economic and monetary union. So an example of that would be like the OECS in our region, and then internationally would be the EU, right? So those are just the different types of trade arrangements that you can have. There's also the unilateral preferences, and that's why I put CARIBCAN separately, because a lot of people say that CARIBCAN is a free trade agreement. It's not. It is not a negotiated agreement. Free trade agreements are agreements which are negotiated. You know, all of these are negotiated agreements between parties. A CARIBCAN is a unilateral preference scheme whereby Canada extends preferences to goods originating from Caribbean countries, certain Caribbean countries. Well, you know, virtually almost all of them, really. But we'll speak more about that. But that's the difference. Whereas a trade agreement is negotiated, a unilateral arrangement like CARIBCAN is not negotiated. It's actually a unilaterally extended preferences scheme, right? Why is that a big deal? It's a big deal because whereas with a free trade agreement or a partial scope agreement, etc., you have agreement between the parties that they're going to set these conditions for trade between them. Whereas with a unilateral preferences scheme, it's only the country which is extending the preferences that, you know, has signed up to do this. And that means that at any time, they could decide, look, I'm not extending preferences to you anymore. So a good example of that would be the US GSP, the Generalized Systems of Preferences, which a few of our countries still, used to benefit from. That that program has lapsed since December 2020. So, I'm sure some of you might have been affected by that. Okay, so now that we have those conceptual things out of the way, one last thing I was to mention to you guys. Some countries also have partial scope agreements, which they didn't sign with CARICOM, they signed on their own. So I mentioned Trinidad and Tobago with Panama, Chile, Venezuela, and then Belize with Guatemala. And I think at one point they were talking about with Honduras as well. There are also preferential trade arrangements, as I mentioned, like CARICAN, CBI, etc. Those are not negotiated. We'll talk a little bit more about CARICAN a bit later. So the important things for you guys as brokers, I mean, this is stuff that you guys would be familiar with. So critical questions: is there a trade agreement or other arrangement in force or provisionally applied between the importing and exporting countries? Because the only way in which you can rely on a trade arrangement is if your country is a party to that agreement, or if your country is a beneficiary under a unilateral preference scheme, right? So you need to figure that out. Is my country, are the country's beneficiaries, right? Another thing you have to figure out would be, is the agreement actually enforced in the country? Because the country could have signed the agreement, but they might not have taken the step to ratify the agreement, and therefore it might not be enforced unless there is arrangement for provisional application. And then what's the type of good? How is it classified? So again, this is stuff you guys will be familiar with as brokers. And now that you don't need to sit down and, go through the whole HS code. You can simply type it in online and find what is the applicable code for the product that you're looking for, right? And as you would know, it's important that you have the correct classification, because that could be the difference between you paying 20% in duty or 40% in duty or no duty at all, right? And then is it good that you're importing covered under the agreement? So you can't take it for granted that because there's a trade agreement that good is necessarily covered, because as you guys might be aware, certain agreements, example would be the EPA, for instance, have phases under which tariffs on the goods are phased out, right? So you need to find out, is the goods covered, and is it within the phase where the tariffs have been phased out? Again, this is a lot easier for you guys now because you have online portals that you can use to assist you with this. It's no longer a case where you have to sit down and literally go through the text of the agreement to figure this out. And then, does the good qualify for preferential treatment under the agreement or arrangement? And you're probably wondering, okay, so what's the difference between that and what I just said? Well, the difference is rules of origin, which you guys will be familiar with. So rules of origin, as you know, establish the criteria for determining whether a product could be considered as originating in one of the parties to the trade agreement or arrangement, and therefore whether that product qualifies for tariff preferences under the agreement or arrangement. So if it doesn't, then it will enter under WTO most favored nation rules, right? So to qualify for preferential tariff rates, usually there are two criteria. So either the product had to have been wholly obtained. This is usually like the case for agricultural goods. So it was wholly produced or wholly obtained or produced entirely in a single country. So examples would be like mineral products extracted from the soil, live animals born and raised, or if you're dealing with more so like manufactured products, etc. Was there substantial transformation? So these are goods that are made from products which come from more than one country, and the origin is therefore defined as that country where the goods were last substantially transformed. And there are several ways in which this could be determined. So value added, so it could be that a proportion of the final value of the product is added in the exporting country. So, and then it could be a change in tariff classification. So if it jumps a tariff heading, that could be evidence of substantial transformation. And then specific processing or manufacturing. So where the value added may not adequately determine originating status, and where specific processes are required to meet originating criteria, that would be an example of specific processing or manufacturing. So so you need to know whether the product actually qualifies, because, for example, if it is that you just import corn from another country, slap it into a can and export it, that wouldn't be seen as substantial transformation, right? You will have to indicate that corn came from XY country, and that depending might not allow the product to qualify as originating, right? You will have to do something more to it. So say, for instance, if you imported mangoes and you turned it into a mango, I don't know, a mango meringue pie or something like that, that would be an example of substantial transformation, because not only has it been processing, but also there will be a change in tariff heading. Yeah. Okay. So as I said, this is stuff I know you guys know already, but it's stuff that I need to go through. Okay. So the meat of the matter, CARICOM's trade agreement. So as you can see, we have several, and most of them were signed in the 1990s, early 2000s. And, you know, the last one would have been 2019, which is the CARIFORUM-UK EPA, which was really a rollover of the CARIFORUM-EU EPA, but we'll get to that shortly. So these, just to mention the product coverage, these agreements here, as you can see, cover only goods. So as you would know, these would be partial scope agreements, these ones. The CARICOM-DR FTA, this would be a FTA, and the others would be considered FTAs as well. Right, and I have mentioned already the unilateral trading arrangements that CARICOM countries benefit from, CARIBCAN, which we'll talk about, CBI, and also USGSP, but that has expired, as I mentioned. Okay, so the Venezuela CARICOM Trade and Investment Agreement. So this was signed in 1992 and entered into force in 1993. And a good source of information for this would be the CSA portal of the Organization of American States, OAS, and they have really good information on these agreements. So we know that this agreement is in force. It is a partial scope agreement, as I mentioned, so there are only certain goods that qualify under this, and it helps to look at the annexes of this. Again, this is something that you don't really have to do because you could use like ITC trade map, etc. But the annexes to this agreement, they tell you which are the products for which there's immediate duty-free access. Products where there's a phase reduction, that would be, so Annex 1 would be the products for which there's immediate duty-free access. Annex 2 is the products on which there is a phase reduction of duties applicable. And that reduction was to take place between 1993 and 1996. And that included more sensitive things like, you know, fish and rums and spirits, etc. And then there's Annex 3, which is products which are not subject to preferential access. So these are products where the MFN rate will apply, right? So that's why I said it's important for you to know what is the coverage, because it's not just because there's a trade agreement, it doesn't mean that the product that you are assisting your customer with would enter duty-free. And then, of course, you have to look at the rules of origin, and that's something that you really should look at. And that will be Article 5, which refers to Annex 4, which outlines the rules of origin in that agreement. And just to note that the agreement is non-reciprocal. So whereas Venezuela is extending preferential treatment to us, CARICOM is not obligated to do the same, right? So another thing is that, and a good example of this would be to, what is important to know about these trade agreements is because in some cases, there are products which come in or which are exported that don't rely on the preferences, they just use the MFN rate, and sometimes that could be a big difference. So example would be like stoves under the Venezuela CARICOM agreement. Under that agreement, it will enter duty-free, a stove, if you're importing a stove from Venezuela, for example. But if you didn't use that agreement and you use just the MFN rate, it will come in at 20%, right? So that just goes to show you that 20% could be a big difference to a business. So it's important for you to understand whether the product actually qualifies, right? So the next one would be the, oh, sorry, I forgot that I have put this here for you guys. This is the list of CARICOM goods excluded from preferential treatment. And another thing to note is that the parties tend to have different schedules. So you will have schedules for CARICOM, you will have schedules for the other party. So in this case would be Venezuela. So it's important to keep that in mind. Okay, these are some of the products that CARICOM will be eligible for immediate duty-free treatment. Okay, so CARICOM-DR. So this started off as a framework agreement and then it became an FTA, and it was the first full FTA negotiated and signed by CARICOM, and it provides for reciprocal preferential treatment between CARICOM's more developed countries and DR, but initially was non-reciprocal in the case of less developed countries. And the goods originating in CARICOM member states have to satisfy the conditions contained in the rules of origin that are in Appendix 1 of that annex, right? And that's why I said it's important to at least have some understanding of the agreement, so you will know what are some of the goods that would be duty-free from each side, what wouldn't be duty-free, etc. And then in terms of the goods originating in the Dominican Republic, those are settled, which would be subject to duty-free entry. Those are settled in separate annexes. So that's why I said it's important to know that the preferences are usually settled in different appendices or annexes, however they're called in the agreement, right? So it's not uniform. Just because a good might be coming from one party, that doesn't mean that it would be duty-free coming from another party. You have to see what the annexes say. And in terms of the CARICOM-Columbia agreement, under this, Colombia agrees to grant products originating in member states of CARICOM free access to its market. Again, there's some non-reciprocity here. And Annex 1, the tariff on products listed in Annex 1 are to be eliminated on entry into force of the agreement. And this agreement entered into force on January the 1st, 1995. And the tariffs and the products in Annex 2 are to be eliminated through equal reduction. So this agreement also had a phased approach as well. And then in terms of Annex 3, these are products that MFN treatment will be applied, right? And then there's an additional list of products chosen by CARICOM, which receive preferential treatment in Colombia beginning in the 4th year after entry into force of the agreement. There is a built-in schedule, so to speak, for this, in that the Joint Council would decide whether more products would be added to the list. So that's why I say that it's good to read the agreement, yes, but remember that if there's been additions to the agreement, that might not always be updated as well. So sometimes it's good to look at some of the databases because those tend to be a lot more updated. So like ITC, trade map, etc., market access map, etc. So another thing is that with this, there is differentiation between CARICOM more developed countries and CARICOM less developed countries. So again, that's something that you have to bear in mind if you're from one of the less developed countries. And this is not my classification, as you know, was outlined under the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas. So it's not that I'm being pejorative to anybody's country, but just in case. Usually there is some sort of difference in treatment between products originating from CARICOM less developed countries versus CARICOM more developed countries. And then in terms of this agreement also has special treatment with regard to treatment of used goods as well. So the reduction of duties provided for in Articles 5 and 6 do not apply to used goods. And it defines used goods as those which are importation, show evidence of wear, and include those goods which are irregular, imperfect, or discarded. So again, there are different levels of treatment for certain types of goods, and you will have to be aware of that, obviously, as you're advising your clients. So CARICOM-CUBA, Trade and Economic Cooperation Agreement, this is another partial scope agreement again. And this one was signed by CARICOM and Cuba on July 5th, 2000. And as we know, there have been updates that have been made. So there was a protocol which provided for the provisional application of the agreement, and a second protocol was signed in 2017, which made several amendments to it. So under this agreement, both CARICOM and Cuban exporters enjoy preferential access to each other's market, but again, this is on separate lists. So the less developed countries of CARICOM under this agreement are not required to grant preferential access to Cuba's products. So both CARICOM and Cuba provide separate lists of goods on which should be immediate duty-free access and on which should be phased reduction of duty. Annex 1 to the agreement sets out the list of goods from CARICOM which receive total duty-free access on entry into force. Annex 2 sets out the list of goods from Cuba which receive total duty-free access on entry into CARICOM, and it also provides for phased reduction of duty to 0%. Annex 3 sets out the list of items originating in CARICOM which receive phased entry into duty. Annex 4 are the goods originated in Cuba which receive phased reduction of duty on entry into CARICOM. And just to note that these lists, the lists in the original agreement were amended, right? So another thing is that the goods produced in or shipped from free trade zones or export processing zones are subject to whatever is the prevailing rate of duty according to the agreement. So CARICOM Costa Rica now, this is the first of the FTAs we're going to deal with. And this agreement was signed in 2004. And well, not the first, because we talked about the year. CARICOM and Costa Rica agreed to progressively eliminate duties on originating goods between them. And CARICOM LDCs were not required to grant preferential treatment to originating goods from Costa Rica. So the products not included in the list under the tariff elimination schedule enter duty-free immediately upon entry into force of the agreement. And then there are other products which are subject to tariff elimination schedules, right? Again, this is not something that you necessarily have to look to the agreement for, because ITC market access map will be able to provide what is the prevailing rate of duty. In terms of free trade zones, the goods originating in free trade zones in CARICOM or Costa Rica are subject to MFN in most cases, but with some exceptions where they're eligible for tariff elimination benefits. And this agreement is interesting because it allows for temporary admission. So parties are required to provide temporary duty-free admission on certain goods. So professional equipment necessary for business activity of business persons who qualify for temporary entry, press equipment, commercial samples, advertising films, etc. Countries are required to provide temporary duty-free admission on those goods. And then they have special treatment for goods re-entered after repair, renovation, or improvement. They have special treatment for like meat of bovine animals, so like beef, etc. And special treatment applicable to oils, fats, and soaps. And then there are certain products which are excluded from preferential treatment. So the big one, which you guys would be probably most familiar with, would be the CARIFORUM-EU Economic Partnership Agreement. And you will see here that it is CARIFORUM, not CARICOM, because it includes the DR. So they signed the agreement in 2008 and is currently being provisionally applied. And for you guys, one of the most important chapters will be Title 1, which is Trade in Goods, Chapter 1, Customs Duties, Protocol 1, which talks about rules of origin, and Annex 1, which deals with export duties, Annex 2, under which the EU eliminates customs duties on all CARIFORUM originating products of harmonized codes, chapters 1 to 97, except for those from chapter 93. And this was done upon entry into force of the agreement, right? But for products of chapter 93, applicable MFN duties apply. So another thing with this agreement is that CARIFORUM states excluded some products from sensitive sectors, or those where customs revenue was important. So CARIFORUM states have up to 25 years, that is up to 2033, to cut import tariffs, and excluded from these cuts were 70% of goods and services, which they consider sensitive. And they're also, well, this isn't really within the scope of this, but if a local industry is threatened because of import surges, the EPAs allow measures to these safeguard measures to protect industrial sectors, infant industries, etc. Right? Article 10, Protocol 1 talks about rules of origin. And it's important to note that this agreement allows for accumulation. Another thing with regard to this agreement is that in terms of export duties, that will be Annex 1, which would be Guyana and Suriname. Annex 2 deals with customs duties on products originating in CARIFORUM states. As I mentioned, CARIFORUM countries have up until 25 years to cut import tariffs. So again, it is important to know whether the good that you are looking to assist your customer with is within that 25-year period, or if it is considered sensitive, etc. So trade commitments in the CARIFORUM UK EPA remain unchanged from those in the CARIFORUM EU EPA, because I'm sure most of you would have been following the discussions about the CARIFORUM UK EPA, basically that the tariff preferences are basically the same as with the EU because it was a rollover, right? Because of Brexit, etc. And what's important here is that in the CARIFORUM UK EPA, EU content and processing can be recognized in the UK and CARIFORUM states exports to one another. So that's really like, a workaround, so to speak. So the only other thing now would be CARIBCAN. So the CARIBCAN customs tariff, remember I said that this is not a trade agreement, this is a unilateral preferences arrangement. This lists 18 countries or dependent territories which are eligible to receive duty-free benefits accorded under CARIBCAN. And there've actually been no deletions or additions to this list since CARICOM was enacted in 1986. So just a note again, this is not an agreement. This is a unilateral thing. So it's based in legislation in Canada. So you probably would be aware that CARIBCAN, similar to with CBI with the US, required a WTO waiver And that waiver expires, the waiver for CARICAN expires this year, December 2023. So now there are discussions to extend it, get the waiver extended. The only product exclusions from this would be goods of HS chapters 50 to 65 inclusive, and goods covered by tariff items with over access commitment rates of duty established in the tarification process. And actually from the statistics I saw, almost, I think about 98% of trade between Canada and CARICOM countries is actually covered by the CARIBCAN agreement. So in terms of useful resources, as I said, it is useful to have some knowledge of the agreements, and that's why I went through, you know, some of the agreements here. But there are online databases that you can use that help you find out what are the applicable rates. So there's ITC market access map, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which shows the, you know, the MFN rate. It also shows if there's a preferential rate in the case where there's a trade agreement for the selected good exported from a selected country. It also shows the requirements needed to import. So it will tell you if there are SPS requirements that you might have to meet. Then there is CARICOM's CARIBGate. I have actually not used CARIBGate, but that's one that I've heard of, and you guys can let me know if you've used it. The OAS CSA Trade Policy Portal. This includes all the trade agreements of OAS members, in case you're wondering where you could find the text. But just note that the CARICOM-CUBA agreement is not there because Cuba is not a member of the OAS. And then there's the Caribbean Exports Portal, which you guys will probably be familiar with as well. And the EU also has a portal that you can use to find out what are the market access requirements for various goods into the EU market. And it's a really, really good portal that you could avail yourselves of. So in terms of takeaways, the key takeaways from this is that, is there a trade agreement in force or a trade arrangement in force between the exporting and importing countries? And key emphasis being enforced or being provisionally applied, because just because there's a trade agreement on paper, that doesn't mean that it might be applicable, right? In our cases, it generally speaking would be, but that's something that you have to bear in mind. Without a trade agreement, the MFN rate of duty would apply, and it's important to know whether they're preferential rates, because sometimes this could be the difference between your client paying no duty or your client having to pay 20%, 30%, 40%, what have you. Trade agreements main text must be read in conjunction with the tariff schedules and any supplementary protocols. But as I mentioned before, because there are these databases now that you can utilize, it's good to understand the trade agreements and know what's there, but you don't necessarily have to go through these schedules line by line like you might have had to years ago, certainly when I was learning, you know, years ago. Schedules are found in the annexes and usually contain which products will have immediate duty-free treatment, which products there's phased liberalization, and those products excluded entirely from liberalization. So just to note, just because there's a trade agreement in force, that doesn't necessarily mean that the product enters duty-free at that time, because it might be part of the list of excluded products, or it might be part of the phased-in products, right? So it's definitely important. It's also important to understand that not every product from each party will be given the same treatment, because both parties tend to have their own schedules there. So just because one product from one party might come in duty-free, that doesn't mean a product from another party might come in duty-free, right? And then several of our agreements provide special treatment for CARICOM less developed countries. So that's important to note, because there might be cases where product coming into CARICOM LDC might not come in duty-free because they're still allowed to charge duties up to a certain period of time on that product. Rules of origin, which you guys would be more than familiar with, must be met. So if the good is not considered an originating good, i.e. it does not meet the rules of origin, it will not qualify for the preferential treatment and it will have to come in at the MFN rate. And then there might be special rules for agricultural products, as you know. So things like certain permits, health certificates, etc. So and then there might be differences in products produced in free trade zones. As I mentioned, there are lots of databases that you could use to help you guys find out what are the market access requirements and conditions within the markets that you are assisting your customer with. So thank you very much for the opportunity. I hope this has been helpful. If you have any questions, you can always reach out to me. If you have any questions, I'm happy to engage with you now.
Thank you, Alicia. That was a lot. Some of it we've heard or think we've heard, but often we need to be reinforced and be reminded, because often we just calling around and not running around with our heads cut off. Any follow-up questions for Alicia from the audience, please? Yes, Mitzi.
Thanks, Mr. President. Morning, everyone. Morning, Lady Alicia. My question is in relation to EU, because what we notice is happening in recent times is that the document that needs to be signed by the authorities in the EU country, sending country, it's not being done. The suppliers are insistent on providing what is called a agreement invoice, and they have a code, but that is not in our database. I'm from Jamaica. I don't know if the same thing applies elsewhere, but it's not in our database. And so customs in Jamaica would not validate that document. So the customer is not able to benefit from the free trade. Do you know if there's anything being done about that and how far along we are in rectifying that situation?
Well, that's not good. Number one. Number two, there are mechanisms by which you guys could flag these things. I'm pretty sure in Jamaica there's a EPA unit, right? EPA implementation unit, if I remember correctly. Right. So I mean, have you flagged that to your EPA implementation unit?
It has been, I know customs is working on it, but since it was a CARICOM issue, my understanding is that it's a CARICOM matter, hence me raising it with you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I don't work for CARICOMs, and I don't like to give advice on situations that I'm not familiar with, and I'm not familiar with that particular situation. But I do know that there are mechanisms that you can use to flag these issues. I don't know if your other colleagues have experienced the same issue as well, but what you can do is definitely raise it with your EPA unit. And they would then be able to escalate it, because there are mechanisms within the EPA, like the various joint councils, etc., that allow for the private sector to raise some of these issues that they're having in terms of these things. There's also the EPA contact points where you're able to reach out to any of the contact points in the particular countries that you're experiencing this with.
We had raised the matter with customs, and I know customs is working on it, but I just thought that you might have had some information, being that it is a CARICOM EU agreement.
Well, yeah, I actually have not heard about that problem. I do know that there are these sticking points, but that particular one I had not heard of. So my best advice to you, having not known or not being fully apprised of the full issue, would be to, as you have done, raise it. Also, you could try to reach out to the contact point in the country with which you're having the issue and see if there could be any assistance there, because there are mechanisms that the agreement provides for to allow you to raise these kinds of issues. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, morning.
Hi, morning. Well, I'm not a broker or anything like that, so but I really truly found this here very interesting. I made some notes here, and I probably going to send you an email to get some of these sites and get information. My question is though, reference free trade, and my free trade knowledge is mostly limited to CARICOM. But I still see, we talk about CARICOM here, but it's still a lot of small barriers that some countries put up. Case in point, I work for FedEx, so I had a visit a customer last week, Thursday actually, and we were discussing, and they manufacture a product and they ship. And they said, in shipping into some of these locations, they have to register the product, do this, do your next, and that kind of thing. And they were saying, like, this is CARICOM, and we are supposed to be moving these goods, and still there's these little internal barriers. I don't know what is being done to try to eliminate this so we can forge a better trading agreement. And because I'm manufacturing something here in Barbados and I want to ship it to that or something, I gotta get the registered product down there, send this, do that, right? It's like we're not even trusting the administration we got here to say, well, Adrian Beckles is making a product to ship. This is what the contents here. This is what we sent to your location here. You accept that. You gotta go and register it. So what's being done to eliminate those questions? That's the question there.
That's a great question. I mean, I like the two questions that were raised so far, because I mean, it reiterates that you could have these agreements on paper, but then it's the implementation that really, the sticking points. To answer your question, Adrian, I do know that and I don't speak on behalf of the CSME unit. I just know that they are working on these things, to deal with some of these sticking points that are still there. Because remember, even though they under the revised treaty of Chaguaramas, they commit to allowing free movement of goods, etc. The countries still have to implement the mechanisms in place, and the harmonization in order to recognize each other's procedures and each other's procedures, etc., in order to allow for that hassle-free movement of stuff. And I empathize with you, because I myself have faced the same issue in terms of trying to, do business across the region and encountering sticking points, or advising clients on some of these things and encountering sticking points. So I do know that it is being working on. A lot of it is because there's still the need for further harmonization of certain procedures, certain laws and regulations, etc. I know it's frustrating and it's cold comfort for you as a business person, but I do know that it's being worked on. What I can advise that you can do is to reach out to CPSO, which is the Caribbean Private Sector Organization, or I don't know if you've done so already. Let them know, because they are the body within CARICOM, which is you have.
I asked the customer to reach out to the chamber.
Okay.
Those trade barriers have been moved from Quartet into the Regional Trade Facilitation Committee, which Cacub, our association, sits on that committee. So they're now dealing with trade matters on that committee, and they focused on it since the end of last year.
Right. Well, I asked the customer to reach out to the local chamber here, to be honest with you, to see if they can get it resolved.
As it relates to implementing, we've noticed in some territories, and Barbados is one for sure, where you've implemented the agreement, but some items you're still not allowing the preferential treatment on. I'm not sure if you're aware of that, but there are lots of complaints. You also have to be reaching out to people's consulates and embassies to say, well, can you double check this with our people, because you're not getting access in a particular territory for a particular product, although it's mentioned in the agreement, but it is not initiated in the system so you can have the access. And that is the big issue.
George Euron from St. Lucia. I am not sure if my question, or not my question, but my contribution, we're speaking about preferential treatment and CARICOM with other nations. But within CARICOM, we have a subgroup, the OECS, where it has been the agreement of the free movement of goods and services and people. The movement of people is accepted is not a problem. However, the movement of goods and services is still within this region. We still have the problem of you pay duties on something in St. Lucia, and you need to send to Dominica, and you have to pay duties again, and all that kind of thing, and which should not be done because of the agreement. I'm not sure if this forum would address this, or if it will be applicable to being addressed in this forum.
I mean, thank you very much, Mr. Elan. But you know, what you're reiterating is what, you know, the other two speakers had similarly reiterated, the fact that you have these agreements on paper, but you still have the lag in terms of the implementation. So until you have that full implementation, there are going to be these sorts of things. So my best advice to you, to all of you, is where you see that you're having these issues, and you know, Louis mentioned that, and you know, I had also mentioned that they are being addressed, right? Not with the alacrity that we would like, but they are being addressed. Is to raise them with the CPSO, which is the Caribbean Private Sector Organization, which is the private sector body recognized by CARICOM. You know, and they would be able to raise these things in quartet meetings. And you know, if when it comes to the EPA, you could raise it with your EPA unit, you could raise it with the contact point, etc. Because these are things that, until there's the full implementation, these are things that are going to come up. So I, by no means am I making light of the issues. As I said, I myself have encountered them myself, and also in terms of advising clients, I have to run out, but that would be my best advice to you, would be to, you know, keep raising these issues, and that will help to put pressure for them to speed up the implementation of them. Yeah.
All right, we're gonna stop here. Margaret.
Morning, everyone. Ms. Nicholls, on behalf of the executive and the members of our association, to say thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule to share with us. And I'm sure that we all have learned a lot. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day and all the best.
Thank you so much to all of you, and to President Ford, sorry, for the invitation, and so your executive. And I really commend you on the initiative. And I definitely look forward. If you have any other questions, you can always feel free to reach out to me. I had put my address in the presentation, so you can feel free to reach out to me if you have any other questions that I could assist with. Okay.
Thank you. I already sent you an email, so when you get
okay, well, that's fast. All right, thanks a lot,
Thank you,
everyone.
Margaret. Thank you, Alicia.
Have a good day.
Everybody.
Bye. Thanks, guys.